We've got quorum in the room. That's exciting. I was not sure about that until yesterday. So first we'll do kind of how we did it last time. We'll do a quick introduction around the room just so that everybody kind of knows where everybody's sitting, for especially for folks that are on the screen. And then we'll just do a quick introduction for the folks that are virtual. And then we'll do our official remote participation motions and move it along. So we'll start.
Excuse me, Grace. This is Barbara. So normally we could see the camera in the room. Is that good? Oh, there you go. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barbara. Okay, so Lenora stepped out, so we'll start with you, Bill.
Managed Zoning Administration.
And Wireless Transport District Office. Behamley Department of Housing.
Reese Hyman, Department of Housing. Megan Van Dam, Housing Department. Anna Shapiro, Department of Housing.
Candace Bennett, at-large planning commissioner.
Fleetwood Housing.
Olivia Simpson, HRA.
Rachel Waldman, HRNA advisors.
Alex Buxton, HRA.
Lost Stan Martin. Brian Riser, yeah. Eric Murray Bodrick, George Mason University. Mike Spots, Habitat for Humanity, DC Nova.
Great. And then Kelly.
Hi, Kelly Atkinson, Department of Planning Development, calling from my home in Alexandria, Virginia.
Barbara.
Barbara Byron, Chairman McKay's office.
Joe.
Joe Mondoro, Providence District Office.
Jill.
Jill Norcross with Northern Virginia Affordable.
Poonam.
Poonam Ramgopal from Supervisor Kathy Smith's office.
And last but not least, Anna.
Hi, this is Anna Galicia with HRNA Advisors.
Great. Okay, so now we'll move on to our confirmation of the remote participation policy. So Virginia law authorizes the remote participation of members of any public body, provided that a policy exists to ensure that such remote participation is consistently administered. The WDU For-sale Policy Task Force adopted the WDU For-sale Policy Task Force policy for remote participation in meetings at our meeting on May 19, 2023. To comply with the policy at our meeting today, we will confirm that first, a physical quorum of the task force is physically assembled at our meeting location, and two, that the voices of the remote participants are able to be heard by everyone in the room. Megan, can you confirm that we have a quorum of task force members present in the room?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Thank you. Next, we will verify that the voice of each member who is participating remotely is clear, audible, at an appropriate volume to be heard in the meeting room, their location, and that their remote participation comports with the policy. So first, Kelly Atkinson, can you please state for the record your name, your location, and why you are participating remotely?
Hi, Kelly Atkinson, Planning and Development, calling in from my home in Alexandria, Virginia, and I have a personal reason for calling from home.
Thank you. Jill Norcross, please.
Yes, Jill Norcross. I am calling from Duck, North Carolina for personal travel.
Thank you. I move that a physical quorum is present here at 3700 Pender Drive for the WDU For-sale Policy Task Force meeting, that these members' voices may be adequately heard, and that their remote participation comports with our remote participation policy. Can I get a second? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. All righty. Just a quick update on the schedule. We are now past our halfway mark on our schedule, so we remain on schedule. And today we will be getting the full program recommendations and initial program for countywide, and then initial program recommendations for Tysons and highways. Any announcements?
Oh, yes. Yes. We wanted to let the task force know that as a follow-up to our first meeting where we talked about how we were working in parallel with changes to the WDU pricing with interest rate changes to the AMI. We are still working on that, and we anticipate that we'll be publishing the new for sale pricing for WDUs for public comment at the end of August. So we wanted to let you all know that, because we're not meeting again until September, that'll be available. Those prices and the new calculations will be available for public comment for 30 days. And we can give an update following that 30-day period to this group in October.
Great. Any other announcements? Okay, then we will move on to recommendations from HRNA, please.
Sure. Yeah, I think you might need to stop sharing. All right. Long time no see. So today we'll be going over some updates to kind of the initial set of recommendations we made during our last meeting. And then we'll also talk about some new recommendations that came out of some financial feasibility testing that we did. So to start, the focus of today's presentation, similar in terms of topics to last time, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the development scenarios that we looked at and some of our initial findings and recommendations that came out of that, as well as some follow-ups from discussion points that we talked about last time. So to start, the first place that we did some additional analysis was we looked into this question of proportionality, or whether WDUs should require to be proportional to the bedroom mix of market rate units. And so one of the things that we did is we looked at the share of WDU units that have sold by bedrooms. And then what we did is we looked at, in terms of all of the units that have sold since 2018 in the county, we identified the sales that had occurred in an area that had been rezoned and in an area where the WDU policy applies. And so given that this is the best approximation to understand the communities where WDUs would be required, and we looked at how the distributions were different. And this was something that was surprising to us. We actually looked at this data a couple of different ways. But what we found was that actually they weren't necessarily underproducing large 3-bedroom units. That I'm noticing here that this was an old version of the distribution. We've had issues with this chart going back and forth. But actually, when we looked at the data, the number of 3 bedrooms that have been produced as WDUs is actually slightly larger than the distribution of units sold in all communities. And so what that led us to do is we actually tested 2 different scenarios in thinking about proportionality. We'll get to the feasibility results, but we looked at the concept of, if we were to cap the size of WDUs at 3 bedrooms and to understand how that would affect project feasibility. But given that we did find that there were a fair number of 4 bedrooms, or I'm sorry, of large units that were being produced as WDUs, we did also test a scenario where the WDUs would mirror the proportionality of market rate units. And so in some cases that meant actually a small number of WDUs would be, in some cases, 4-bedroom units. This is also in line with the data that we've seen, where there actually have been production of some 4-unit WDUs. And while we'll get into the details a little bit later on the specifics of the feasibility analysis, we actually did find that because the proportion, we were seeing a fair number of large bedrooms being produced as WDUs, and the feasibility of including those units at WDUs was feasible in most locations. We're actually recommending here to codify in the policy that the bedroom mix of WDUs should be proportional to the market rate unit bedroom mix. And this isn't the exact language that currently exists in the Tyson's policy. And so we can get into some of the feasibility of that a little bit later, but did want to touch on that we did that additional analysis.
And we have the updated chart.
For some,
glitchy.
this chart is glitchy and we've changed this back and forth a few times. I apologize. I don't know why it is not updated in this deck, but that's something that we can share with you all. The second thing that we looked at is different scenarios of tying resale prices to AMI. So I know last time we had talked about, made the recommendation of tying resale prices from CPI to AMI, and looked at a couple different scenarios of, would we tie it to AMI and not have a cap? Would we tie it to the 5-year compounded annual growth rate of AMI? Or would we tie it to the 10-year annual compounded growth rate of AMI? And so we did that analysis looking at a couple different scenarios of how that would tie to resale price over the past 6 years, and found that generally, as we said before, tying it to AMI makes the most sense, because CPI is not necessarily the most tied to the housing market, versus AMI is directly related to housing affordability. We recommend to tie it to the 5-year rolling AMI growth rate instead of the 10-year. The reason for that is because the 5-year is going to naturally have a little bit more fluctuation in it, and is going to mirror year-to-year changes in AMI a little bit more closely, which is a little bit reflective of how the housing market is actually functioning. And so because of that, we recommend using the 5-year, tying to the 5-year AMI over the 10-year AMI. But this is one that we're sort of open to discussion and hearing from you all on your thoughts, because we certainly think there could be an argument to be made for using the 10-year AMI as the benchmark. I think for us, our strongest recommendation is really tying it to AMI, and whether it's 5-year or 10-year, I think we feel a little bit less strongly about.
Any thoughts?
Really briefly, from my perspective, I think that this approach, while still recognizing that this is a limited equity type of home ownership, it does allow for some additional wealth creation for the buyers. So I also like that it allows for a realistic increase in growth, but that it is sort of smoothed out by the 5-year averaging. So.
One of the challenges we're going to have is, just given sort of our conversation last week, we had this reset of the resale prices that we're working towards, and particularly in the household size arena. I mean, I think there's, everything else is a little bit more market fluctuations, but I think we're going to have a challenge generally, and this is just sort of putting this out there, that like if there's sale prices at the higher end previously that have sold and are currently owned, we're always going to have this sort of challenge on the back end. So we were kind of talking a little bit about how to model that out, and potentially looking at some of our recent sales in the WDUs to see how that tracks with the 5-year AMI and the 10-year AMI, just to make sure that the problem is we just don't know what's going to happen with AMI. So, one thing that, they did look at sort of 10 years back, and, AMI used to go up in a very steady kind of way, and, a little bit every year. And then now with the major jumps in the incomes in our region, it's become, very volatile, or very, sort of high income region. So I think that part has been challenging to figure out. How do we really do we reset? And is this sort of the new starting point of where we're going to be going? Will the AMI ever go down? No clue. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of put that out there. Some of the background thinking that we were trying to figure out of there's just, it's very hard to predict, but I think kind of going back to, it'll be something we'll have to kind of check in on and continuously sort of evolve the program. So, I think either one would be a good starting point.
Yeah. The other important point there is that there is an associated risk in home ownership, and it's not a guarantee that you're going to build a certain amount of equity, or, so that's part of the design here as well. There's no guarantee that you're going to.
have to message it properly to.
Right.
Yeah. Mike?
Like, yeah.
Yeah, I think using the 5-year, that sounds like the 5 years, that seems like the better approach. It does include that smoothing, but 10 years is an eternity in a housing market. And so you're looking at, you're looking at what would happen if the market after 10 years, a long period of time of going up, starts even just flatlining or much as market going downward. If you're using the 10-year AMI, right now, it has the 10-year AMI would have the impact of limiting on sort of the upside, but if you're using 10-year, if I'm doing the math in my head correctly, and so correct me if I'm wrong, so it's certainly possible because I'm just doing this off the cuff. But in a scenario where after a long period of increase, we have 3, 4, 5 years of decline or stagnation, then you might be in a scenario where you have expectations for purchase prices based on the formula that exceed the ability of like a household at that AMI level to pay, given all the dynamics that are going on. So, obviously, again, getting to the point where like this is the max purchase price for resale, not the guaranteed purchase price. But I just think that the 5-year AMI kind of strikes that balance. There's not, there's the non-trivial gap in the amount in the purchase price amount, but it's not like we're like enormous differences. So yeah, I'm comfortable with 5-year AMI as the standard.
I have a question. I'm fine with the 5-year, but going back to the prior recommendation, I don't understand the logic. So say that after further analysis, the distribution of what came on market for market rate versus WDU as far as bedroom count was pretty consistent. So why would we codify the requirement to be proportional? I don't know. ADUs, does it have to be necessarily, like if you had townhomes and 202s, would you have to, 5-bedroom townhomes and 3-bedroom 202s, you'd have equally distributed. I could be wrong, but to me, I made this comment last meeting. I just don't understand. I think there is going to be inevitable impacts to marketability or the economics of our projects requiring proportionality, and I just question language.
Sure. So that's something that we actually did look into when we get into our feasibility testing, like what would be the financial impact, including larger units as ADUs. So one of the things that we noticed when we did look at the data, and I have the corrected chart that I can show here as we talk through this. One of the things that we did see, let me share this, was actually there were no 5-bedrooms or very few 5-bedrooms that were actually built in these communities that we identified required WDUs overall. There were some 4-bedrooms that were built in these communities and that have been built as WDUs in the past. So we looked at 2 different scenarios when we did our feasibility testing. We looked at one where there's 4 bedrooms, then the market rate component would be 3 bedrooms in the WDU. We also looked at a scenario where the portion of 4-bedroom units that were built as market rate, there'd be a reflective proportion of those that were built as WDUs. And we actually found that in both scenarios that the development was still feasible, because in the grand scheme of things, what we found is it was not that many units. It was maybe a handful of 4 units in an 150 unit.
Yeah, and I can assure you, there's a massive impact. I do this for a living, actual models that, and we are doing 5-bedroom townhomes going forward, and so to then say that now we have to provide 5-bedroom WDUs, and there's different price points as far as paying for land, the development costs and allocations and all that, and it would materially impact viability of some of these projects, especially after we've done, gone hard in the deal and haven't been submitted yet, been accepted yet. So midstream, having to then change the allocation to dramatically impact viability of the projects. So I don't really understand why, we need a whole bunch of $22 million WDUs, in the market. When, a 2-over-2, 3-bedroom, it's got, 2.5 baths, 1 car garage, it's got all the pieces in there. I just don't understand need, for it, or need for it.
So a couple things. So first off, we looked at 4 bedrooms, but when we looked at our data, we weren't really seeing 5 bedrooms that had been built in the past. So we only looked at 4 bedrooms, not 5 bedrooms. So that was sort of our baseline assumption, and we're happy to have a conversation kind of outside of this task force meeting, like specifically on assumptions. The other thing that we looked at is when we tested both scenarios, the more aggressive scenario would be to require proportionality. And because we saw that in our model that including a small proportion as 4 bedrooms would be feasible, that was what made us go with this particular recommendation. We do feel that if it's we know that the interest of Fairfax County is to have family-sized units. And if there was agreement among this group that a 3-bedroom unit would suffice, I think that that's a recommendation we could be comfortable with. But given what our feasibility testing was showing, given that there have been larger 4-bedroom units built as WDUs in the past, that's why we went with sort of the more aggressive or recommendation. And typically when we do these kind of programs, sort of the baseline assumption is proportionality. And so that's why that is how we landed on this additional recommendation. But again, happy to sort of have that discussion.
I think also, and we'll get a little bit into this with another recommendation, but sort of the treatment of the 3 versus the 4 versus the 5-bedroom units. We're not seeing a lot of, we think that even just mirroring the family size units, so the 3, 4, 5, kind of all being treated as, 3 accomplishes the family size unit, which is the county's priority. So we're not actually making a recommendation that a 4 or a 5 has to be.
We found it with the 4, we found it was feasible. So again, that's why we went with the more aggressive recommendation here. But again, sort of going back to where we have our recommendations that we feel sort of more strongly about. In some cases, we have recommendations that based on the data, this is where we're going with. We certainly think that there could be an argument to be made for treating 4 or 5-bedroom units and having them be 3 bedrooms. But just because of where we landed our analysis, it seemed it was feasible to do some 4s. That's how we landed here. But we're open to.
So, and as I'm thinking through this, I think there could be, and these are different types of different kind of a model of what you're building compared to what we're building. So I guess my question would be, could it be, what is the main trade? If I'm understanding this correctly, there's sort of a feasibility, there's obviously a feasibility difference. Could that, as we're thinking about trade-offs, like, would it be fair to say that, let's just say it could be the difference between getting, larger development, getting 12 3-bedrooms versus 8 5-bedroom WDUs if we were to do that. Like, is that, are the cost differences that of the magnitude that we're saying that we're doing proportionality at 5s, we're actually leaving potentially units on the table, affordable units on the table.
I mean, what I'm reading, and maybe I'm understanding it wrong, is like, say I have 150 units of which, 75 are, 5 bedrooms and 75 are 3 bedrooms. I have to do an equal amount of the WDUs. Like if I have 10 WDUs, 5 of them have to be in the 5 bedrooms and 5 have to be in the 3 bedrooms. And I'm just saying that it dramatically impacts the financials and the viabilities of the projects. And also, I think as we continue to look at these projects, we're doing a lot more, different products within a community. So you might have 24s, 20s, 2-over-2s, and and the 24s will have that 5-bedroom. It's just, that's a really expensive, elaborate home. And it's like, really, is that really what we're trying to get after here? It's trying to,
And that's how, like, if we had trade-offs, I would rather have, and in real world this year, I don't know if what I'm saying now pencils out at all. So I would rather have, if what the WD requirements are on a bit of a sliding scale, I'd rather have 12 3-bedroom WDUs than 10 or 8 5-bedroom WDUs.
Right.
So that, to me, and fours are kind of in that gray area because, there are some very large families here that might require a 4, but maybe there is some way to say like proportional number of family size units, and depending on the definition. I agree, like we occasionally build 4 bedrooms, in terms of our market is lower income households, and we have a lot of larger families, so we occasionally build 4 bedrooms, but generally speaking, 3 is our target. So it wouldn't give me a lot of heartburn to just say the number of family size units. We define that is proportional to number of family size units in the overall.
I think that would work. Yeah, definitely.
And to your point, Martin, when we were looking at the data, as we'll get into, we actually designed some scenarios of like, there's a couple different developments that have a mix of product types, and we based them off of what we had seen kind of being built in the market today that had WDUs. We weren't necessarily seeing at that time what you're describing of mostly 5 bedrooms and a couple 3s. That's just not reflective of our data. So that wasn't necessarily what we were modeling. And so that's why, again, seeing what we were seeing in the market of the kinds of developments that had included WDUs, based on those scenarios, which were mostly 3 bedrooms, but a small number of 4s, that penciled in our book. But what you're describing of 5s and 4 bedrooms, that's, we understand that could change.
I think we just need to hear from you guys about which do you privilege? Is it getting family size units? Does the county want family size units, and we're going to lump in, 3, 4, and 5 and assume that gets you X number of families? Or how important is it to you to get into your stock 4 or 5 unit bedrooms WDUs? And that's really the trade-off there.
I put a pin in that, and I think Eric had a comment.
I think the last time we met, there was some discussion about an incentive program where if you had 4 bedrooms, you would be designated to be compliant with more WDU requirements as an incentive, but not a requirement, not a strict requirement like this. Was that option something that you considered, or what is the benefit of this codifying the actual ratios versus that incentive approach?
So a couple of things. We actually did discuss internally the incentive approach and have found that in other markets where they've tried to have this different scale, it's actually very difficult to administer and to track because you just have different requirements across different projects. And so found that just from an administrative standpoint, that actually wasn't necessarily the direction that we thought made sense to go with this program. And so that was why we, after sort of those initial discussions, didn't necessarily think that it was the best fit for this program.
I think there may be room for discussion though, because I think, as I just sort of the process has a bit of kind of like a give take sometimes. I think in the sort of the way we discuss proffers generally, and I wonder if, if we put in the kind of requirements, the family size unit, would, I guess, developers be open to having the conversation where we do potentially get a couple 4s or a 4 here or there, 5? Because I think there is a real concern that there are large families who cannot be accommodated, and that gap keeps growing with the construction. That if we only produce up to, if sort of it's a 3+, then 3s are always going to be produced, right? And so I think that we, in recognizing that there is some math there that we would have to kind of look at the, sort of what the trade-off is. I think we would love to have some produced. So if there is room for kind of some proportionality, but not like a direct, I'm not sure how we kind of open that door. Maybe Tom has an idea for that, but I definitely think that we'd love to still get some out of this program. Maybe 4s is more a reasonable thing to ask, but I think that that's really a space that we just need to forward looking. We need to have that in the county.
And I can just speak also on Stanley Martin's behalf, is that, I think there is a serious distinction between, at least for us, very much production builder. We don't typically have townhomes or 2/2s that allow for more than 3 bedrooms. So getting back to kind of Martin's point, it does become a big feasibility issue for us because currently in all of our 2/2 projects, we use the
WDU and ADU unit that we offer as an ADU or WDU is the same as all we offer as a market rate. It's just options internally that are different. So in order for us on the townhome or 2/2 side, the only thing that's going to change our bedroom count is upping our square footage of the overall unit, which goes back to Martin's point of that is detrimental to the feasibility of some of our projects because that's going to lower unit count overall. So I think it is difficult because, you know, I know Martin they're going to start doing 5-bedroom townhomes, but to try to come up with an incentive across the county to try to get builders to do more 4 bedrooms when it's not really something that we do, in general, it could be kind of a challenge, I guess.
Well, not if it's not already in the development, right? Like it would be sort of the proportionality kind of piece where, maybe there's a 3+ baseline, but if we can eke out a 4 or 5 here or there, or a couple that maybe there's a trade-off for.
I think it is. I think an incentive. I mean, I think that would be very open to that discussion.
And to your point, I mean, there has been times, Supervisor Smith's office, where, we had 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and 4 bedrooms, we had condos on site, and we did allocate the ADUs actually to the 3 bedrooms. That, and that was something at a request, and similar to another project. So I think when there is times and opportunities to do that, working through the proper process with the supervisor seems to be the most appropriate way to handle it because it's more of a case-by-case basis. And I think we would definitely be interested in continuing that process going forward. But a requirement, to proportionality would be quite difficult for us to maintain or to achieve.
Thanks, everyone.
So now to get into, though, we started talking a little bit about feasibility. Just wanted to talk a little bit about our approach before then kind of diving into how we use this testing to inform some of our recommendations. So just a quick refresher on how we think about feasibility. So you have your development costs, hard costs, soft costs, and land costs. And then you have the required revenues from sales that you're needed to support those development costs, accounting for a return as well. And so the way that a WDU program can affect that balance is if you're getting less revenue from the sales of WDUs, that's where you need to have some incentives to help fill that gap. And so when we were testing different scenarios, we were sort of looking at how different requirements for ADUs sort of affected this gap and whether projects still had a baseline level of return for the builder and investor. And so how we defined whether a project was feasible or not is we used equity multiple as our indicator. And so equity multiple is defined as the total amount of equity invested in a project. And then you have the total cash distributions that come back to the builder. And we used a 2.0 equity multiplier as sort of our first marker for feasibility, which means that there's about twice as much money coming back in distributions as there is equity invested. We also looked at an equity multiple of about 1.7 as what we called a borderline scenario. And so what we mean by these is that projects aren't necessarily, every single project isn't necessarily going to say if this project has or does not have this exact equity multiple, doesn't necessarily mean that that project will or won't get built. We like to think of these as a little bit of a distribution. So if we're modeling a scenario and find that that scenario has an equity multiple of a 2, that really means that that's at sort of the middle of the distribution. And there could be similar projects that, because of their own individual economics, might have different levels of return. We can't necessarily model every single possible iteration, every single possible type of structure, but we did develop a series of scenarios that we tested against these metrics.
So should we just say in basic math terms there, if you invested $1 million in a project and you had cash distributions out of the project of 2 million, you would be at a 2. You would have put in 1 million and you would be at a 2. That would be a 2x, right?
And so then how we did our feasibility testing, recognizing that in this particular program, there's multiple types of products. And then in some cases, developments will have multiple products even within the same community. And so we looked at 4 product types: townhomes, stacked townhomes, non-high-rise condos, and high-rise condos. And we looked at these 4 product types across 5 different scenarios that were reflective of developments that we were seeing in Fairfax today. So we looked at just a townhome community, a community with townhomes and stacked townhomes, a community with townhomes, stacked townhomes, and condominiums, as well as a standalone non-high-rise condominium and a high-rise condominium. And so what were we trying to answer? What were the questions we were trying to answer with the feasibility analysis? And so the first question we were trying to understand is, we are recommending changes to how we're calculating the pricing and the AMI levels served by the program. We covered those last week. And so one of the things we wanted to understand were, do these changes by themselves significantly impact the feasibility of proposed projects? We also wanted to understand, which is the conversation we were having earlier, is what would be the impact of aligning the WD unit mix to perfectly mirror the unit mix by bedroom for the market rate units. We also did testing on how the distribution of units across AMI levels would impact feasibility. So that included more heavily weighted units in the up to 80% AMI category, as well as we also tested having a percentage of WDUs be affordable at up to 70% AMI. And then finally, we looked at the possible extension of the high-rise policy outside of Tyson's, and the extension of the current county-wide WDU policy to other areas in the county where medium to high density is currently planned. And so before we kind of dive into our analysis, did want to at least start off by giving you kind of our recommendations based on our analysis. And so the first one is when we looked at the impact of the new pricing model and eliminating the 100 to 120% category, we found that it had a very minimal impact on project feasibility. The second finding we had, which is just what we had discussed before, was about codifying the bedroom mix of WDUs, but we know that that's a point that's still under discussion with this group. We also looked at just extending the affordability levels and found that if you were to extend a proportion of units to be affordable at up to 70% AMI, that most project types would still be feasible. And then finally, we looked at extending the program. And we found that when we looked at the areas that were zoned for medium to high density development, and we looked at where they were located and the price point at which homes were selling in those areas, we actually recommend that the policy could be extended to those areas. On the other side, we looked at extending the high-rise policy outside of Tyson's, and actually found, due to the market conditions and the sales prices needed to support a high-rise condominium development, there are very few places in the county that those sales prices could be achieved. Really, in Tyson's was sort of the place that you could achieve the 800 plus sales per square foot number. And so we actually found that at this time, doesn't necessarily make sense to extend the high-rise policy. Yeah.
I think it'll help to see the everything sort of in your analysis.
So to start, just as a little bit of a refresher from last time, we discussed eliminating the 100 to 120% AMI band for the program. And the reason for that is because, as we discussed last time, 42% of the units that are at 120% AMI haven't sold. And of the units that have sold, all of them required some sort of pricing reduction, whether that was a adjustment for condominium fees or an actual decrease in the sales price. Generally speaking, these units were not even selling for that initial 120% AMI price. The other thing that we discussed last time that we walked you through is all of the changes to the pricing model and how it actually affected pricing moving forward. And so here we just have an example of if we were to use the existing model and the updated model for a 3-bedroom priced at up to 100% AMI, the difference in pricing is only about 3%.
Quick question, clarification. When you say existing model, that is the max allowable purchase price at 120% AMI, or what they're actually on average selling for after price adjustments?
It's the max.
The max, okay. So that in reality, the difference between what an 100% AMI pricing in the updated model and what 120% AMI units are selling for today, that difference is less than 3%.
Yeah. Well, so what this is saying is that we are eliminating the 120% category altogether.
Right.
And so what this is, we're doing that, but we are also adjusting the sales price across the board to be more reflective of market factors.
Okay.
And so what this is actually saying is that if we were to use the existing pricing model, the existing assumptions, the max sales price for a 3-bedroom unit at 100% AMI would be a $490,000 number.
Okay.
And then under kind of the updated model, it would be $475,000, which is a difference of about 3%.
Okay, so got it.
Okay, Tom had a.
No, I just wanted to clarify in my own mind. So the chart on the left refers to the existing 120s. The chart on the right effectively says, you know, you're at the top income you're going to serve is 100%. And this is how the new pricing model would look.
Yes.
As compared to the existing.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And so we looked at just how these changes by themselves, not making any other adjustments to the policy, how that would affect project feasibility kind of across those different scenarios. And we actually found that under the existing pricing scheme was feasible across all of our scenarios. It was borderline for high-rise construction, just going back to what we said before about the economics of high-rise construction, just really because of the construction typology, it's just very expensive to build. It requires very high sales prices. And we actually found that with the new pricing scheme, the effects were de minimis. We actually found that return was about 1% difference between the new pricing structure and the existing pricing structure. So in terms of project feasibility, we didn't find a significant difference between the new structure and the existing pricing structure.
When you say feasible, is that the 1.7?
2.0.
2.0. Okay.
Borderline would be the 1.7.
Borderline goes from 1.7.
Borderline goes from 1.7 to 2.0.
So these are 2.0 feasible.
Or higher.
And I think that borderline fell like what, like around 1.9.
It was around 1.9.
It's pretty close.
Yeah. And I think that's more just speaks to the economics of high rise. And there's only, we'll get to this later, there's only been one high rise condominium built in the past 20 years in Fairfax, because it is just so difficult to make those kind of projects.
We did have an application in Reston and prompted this question.
Yeah.
Kind of just have built.
And you said, yeah.
What should I say?
They proffered to the WDU policy.
But it wasn't, and we sort of looked at that too, but it wasn't built because it's just the sales prices needed to support the development are 7 figures.
I don't know if the lower WDUs would made an impact one way or another.
I'm so curious about the sidebar conversation that's happening. So gentlemen. Mike, Edward, could you guys share with us? Because we really.
I was just.
You guys are talking
John and I, just to be clear, we're not working on those kind of profit margins. It's really competitive out there. So it's way smaller. But in theory, like, I mean, just listen, we're not selling it at the top price point anyway. So you're talking $50,000. No one's selling it at the 120 anyways. So, I mean, I agree with your conclusion. The way you got there, it's just probably, you're looking at math that we don't typically look at, and it doesn't match our models. We do operate much thinner margins, like way thinner.
It could be helpful if you're able to share after this more of your data.
Sure.
I think we've got a lot of data junkies around this table, so I'm sure people would like to see kind of the map.
We weren't necessarily gonna like walk through in this presentation at a granular level, but in the back of this presentation, there's an appendix that actually lists all of our assumptions for our modeling. So, and again, happy to like have an offline conversation.
I think though that, the most important thing we heard here, recognizing that, that there may be some, a delta between, kind of the data used for the analysis and some of the experience that Chaos and Stanley Martin are experiencing. What I think we're hearing though is that there's a consensus that this is about right.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of how you define feasible and borderline. I think our feasible is, can we break even on the WDU units that we sell versus our costs associated?
Yeah.
So
I guess
everyone has their own definition, I guess.
one point of clarification is we're looking at this in sort of the entire development. So when we say all townhomes, we used, I think it was 100 townhome development. And so we were looking at the feasibility of entire development, market rate units, and the WDU. So this isn't necessarily just looking at the feasibility of just the WDUs. It's looking at how changes to the WDUs affect that entire project feasibility.
Yeah, thinking about like, what we don't want is for WDU an affordability requirement to be a poison pill for the whole thing, right?
Yeah, I think the other thing, just to really hone on as well, and that's obviously the one part of it, but again, one of the first things I brought up when we met, I think first or second meeting, was again, just the disparity between the max price and what we're actually selling those for. So that really plays into, I guess, the analysis that you guys have done, because I think the data that we saw on the average price, those homes that were sold at the different AMI levels was really jarring to me, because again, that plays into why those homes sit for so long as well, because we're not having them at a realistic price in certain market. So that's, again, kind of plays into this as well.
Yeah, and I think that was sort of the underpinning of our thought of, well, that issue seems to be very acute for those priced at 120% AMI. So that's why we decided to eliminate or recommended eliminating that. And then also recommending sort of market realities, why we recommended adjusting the model to decrease prices slightly to try to get at that issue sort of from two different angles. And so this is just the distribution of WDUs by bedroom count, same chart as before.
Updated.
This is the updated one.
Yeah,
Apologies
14%
with
on
the
that.
previous one. So this is showing the WDU program bedroom distribution. This top line is when we look at the units that have been produced as WDUs, the bedroom distribution. And then the bottom line is when we identified those units that, to the best of our ability, given kind of the data available, units that were produced in communities that would trigger or where the WDU policy would apply, that's the bedroom distribution. And so this is kind of going back to the discussion we had earlier, which is when we did our feasibility testing of the proportional unit mix. And because of the data we had found before, just looking at the overall unit mix of WDU projects, as well as looking at comps we were seeing in the market about the distribution of bedroom types across different product types. We did include some 4-bedrooms in this proportional unit mix, but we didn't necessarily include 5-bedroom or larger units because based on what has been built to date, we weren't seeing a lot of those in these communities. And so when we did the feasibility testing looking at the proportional unit mix, again, we did find that across the board, when you look at the project in its entirety, that projects were still feasible. But again, this is going back to the conversation about how we want to handle the family units moving forward, about whether it makes sense to have the 3-bedroom plus with the ability to negotiate and proffers for fours. I think that's something from a policy perspective, we think makes sense. Just given what we were seeing in the data, that was why, again, we sort of went with the more aggressive initial recommendation. So the second thing we looked at after bedroom mix was looking at the distribution of WDUs across AMI bands. And so our baseline scenario was looking at an even distribution. Because we removed the 120s, the 120s are no longer included in the scenario. But using that even distribution between up to 80% and up to 100%. We also looked at a scenario that included more 80% units, or that was more heavily weighted toward 80% units. And then we included a scenario that did include a small proportion of units at affordable at up to 70% AMI, with those being evenly distributed. And then similarly, we did find that across all of the different scenarios, other than high rise, while there were slight differences, relatively de minimis, between the different scenarios, in all cases, was still feasible in our analysis. And so because, again, it was feasible in our analysis, we did go with what we would say is the more aggressive, or the one that sort of is the most, gets the largest and deepest affordability of even distribution with a proportion of units affordable at up to 70% AMI.
We're proffering a lot of our communities at 80% right now. I mean, I guess we have scenario 1 or scenario 2, I guess it's the 3% of the 100. So you get 9 and 8. I mean, we have no problem selling 80%. So, and like I said, I think most of our projects now have ADUs, and then there's not that many WDUs kicking in because of the change in classifying 2x2s as townhomes. So there's not, WDUs aren't coming up as much as they had in the past. So you're getting, I think you're going to get a lot more ADUs out of these projects. Not sure, you know, there's a need to change the allocation, and then when those projects, when you do have a lot of WDUs, again, we're proffering a lower amount. I'm not sure if, you know, if with that information, is that, do we need to rechange the allocation? And if you did change the allocation, is even scenario, I guess, I don't know, it's that scenario 2 in the middle, would that be better than the third one? Because at least you get 9% and the 80%. But if you did last one, it would be like 8% at 80 or less.
I have just a slightly different changes because I got about 32 or 2 WDUs come down the pipeline. So I think from our perspective, again, with the 2/2s, you really can't change the product type from your market rate units to your WDU and ADU units. So I think, you know, just from our standpoint, we'd like to see the even distribution, just because as far as recouping those costs, we're spending just about money for market rate as we are, you know, outside the options included. So
Yeah, I agree.
selfishly.
I agree exactly the same thing. Our market rate is identical to the WDU.
I will say, just a point of clarification, the comparison of the ADU and the WDU, just because we're talking about lowering the AMI tier down to 70%, there is a different pricing model between ADUs and WDUs. So we're not, you wouldn't be assuming the same sales price for the 2 units. They're getting closer. They're likely going to get closer as we change the WDU prices, but it might be worth talking to the group about actually seeing what those numbers are.
And we, again, in the back of this presentation, we do have an appendix where we actually have what those sales prices are.
Yeah.
So,
And where are we talking about them?
I think I said it before also, it's just that, you know, WDUs only kick in is because you didn't utilize the density bonus provided in the zoning because you provided affordables. And so, I don't know, just it does seem like we're pushing more and more onto the developer community when they're not even getting the offset of the benefit of the density bonuses. And if they are able to get the density bonuses, then they are providing 80, which are dramatically less price than even the 70s, to your point. And so I just think that current crop of communities and the WDUs you have out there, it's going to get smaller as we burn through the zoning cases that were done 3 years ago when 202s were classified as multifamily.
Can we go back to your point?
The ADU, WDU, I mean, the ADU bonus is really only applicable when you're talking about the stacks and A tax, but just to get to multifamily, they're typically not going to be ADUs because of the construction type.
What I'm saying is like a lot of our communities are towns and 202,
Right.
right? In the past, W202s were classified as multifamily,
Yeah.
exempt from the ADU process. So that's why you have a lot of WDUs right now. That's been cleaned up, I think, in 2021, I think. And so now they're treated as townhomes, and so you're getting a lot more. One of my projects went from 100% WDUs to now 100% ADUs. So I just don't think you're going to see as many going forward.
Right. And stacks in towns, I agree with you there, but it's the multifamily, the WDs where you're not triggering ADUs typically
Yeah, we're not
for sale.
We're not doing too many more condo flats anymore.
Okay.
The economics of those are just. Our preference would be to keep it split.
Say that again.
One more time.
I think hearing I don't want to speak for John, but from my perspective, my preference is to keep it at how it is right now, just 6 and 6, so the 80 and 100. And we're dropping 120 already, so we've made a lot of progress, and we're also dropping the sales prices in this analysis. So I think we've came a long way in making a lot of improvements, and I don't think we need to go all the way to now changing price tiers. And
I think, it would maybe be helpful to have that conversation between kind of sort of your model and the analysis that was done. And maybe that's like an offline conversation to try to kind of work through that because, from a public sector perspective, looking at something like this, it seems like, wow, gosh, these are like incredibly achievable and these small changes aren't moving the needle very much. And it's better to sort of balance the program. If it's not a big impact on the people making the units, then for us, like we should balance the program based on what our need is. So, I mean, just kind of from the county perspective. And so I think there's like an argument to be made of like, there's simplicity, there's like, but I think like even if we do go the like, if we don't end up going with this 70% units, I mean, I think it's still very worthwhile for us to consider the larger proportion of 80% because that's where really we see a lot more need. And if we're not going to go, lower, at least if we're making more units available at that, sort of lower moderate income, then at least it'll help us be able to leverage our financing sources and other things to help people at 60%, those lower incomes get to a price they can afford versus if we have a bunch of 100% created. I just don't think that's going to serve really. I don't know. It's sort of not going to serve the proportions we really want to target eventually, right? So I think if we have the ability and we have the, it's not a major impact. I would like to sort of see, being a little bit more aggressive, and maybe it's not to the highest extent, but yeah. So I think that might be the devil's in the details of like how those two analyses are coming together. Because if you will, and I understand. I mean, I think there's sort of like the data analytical analysis and there's the pro forma kind of IRR analysis, and then like they're different ways of coming at the same question. But if we can't, I think we do need to kind of like marry those up and just see where the gaps are and make sure that feasible category is. Yeah. But I mean, and I guess just to add, like, could you just like describe sort of in real dollars, sort of what the impact of the reduction, sort of like as you're looking like sort of a sale price, like tens, hundreds, millions, like how many dollars does this impact a project to reduce?
We have an analysis, I think, either in the appendix or we have it in a different document. I believe it's in the tens of thousands of dollars.
So like the total project cost is like tens of millions, hundreds of millions, like it's just like
Tens of millions.
so it's like proportionally, it's a pretty like kind of almost a drop in the bucket to make these small adjustments. So I tend to think that like no matter what model you kind of use, the impact is going to be pretty small because of, and I think as you guys kind of had sort of pointed out, the rental program went from like this, these levels to like an entirely new structure at lower levels, whereas we're sort of just like shifting a little bit. And I thought that's an interesting way to look at it.
And one of the things, and like, happy to sort of, again, have that conversation, talking more details, that actually the more at 80 and the extended affordability, the effect on return was actually was almost identical in a lot of ways, that the difference between those two scenarios in particular was very, very, very small, because yes, you're extending down and getting some 70s, but you also have a slightly larger number than 100s. So it actually kind of canceled out in a lot of ways. Those two were very similar. So last set of recommendations was on the extension of the policy. And so the first thing that we looked at was just identifying the areas that are currently zoned mid to high density, or the places that sort of contemplating extending the policy. And so on this map just indicates where those places are. And as you can see, for the most part, they actually are on the outskirts of places where the policy already applies. And so when we saw that, the next thing that we did is we looked at in these areas where the policy, currently applies, accounting for the age of homes that have sold and the number of bedrooms of homes that have sold, how does that compare to home sale prices in areas that we might extend the policy? With the idea of trying to understand if there was a difference in sales prices between where we might extend the policy and where it exists today, then we would worry about feasibility concerns. What we found is when we compared the sales prices in the areas that you might extend the policy and the sales prices of where the policy exists today were in some cases higher, but across the board were very, very similar. And so because of that, given that the extension of the policy would mostly be an extension of where it exists today, and we weren't necessarily concerned about there being a significant impact on feasibility because of the similarities in home sale prices. In this case, we actually do recommend that you can extend the policy to the zoning areas, which there is county jurisdiction, which we understand in places like Vienna and some other places in the county. It's still sort of in flux of how it could be applied, but in general, we found that it would make sense to extend the policy.
So just to be clear, there's no, I guess it's not in flux, it's just like isn't applicable. So I think it's just kind of whether we want to explain to them, here's some of our findings, and wondering if the towns would be interested in kind of adopting something similar. But I think the analysis is very interesting just in terms of like, just geographically, but I think that's an important thing to remember just in the task force, that while it might show up on the map, it might still not be part of our jurisdiction.
My perspective, just taking off the sort of developer hat and putting on just like, what's the goal of a policy like this? There's two. We talk a lot about unit production, but I think underappreciated aspect of this when people talk about the effectiveness or lack thereof in some cases of inclusionary housing programs is like, yes, you're paying for affordable housing production, or you're trying to create affordable housing production, but a key policy goal that gets undersold and undervalued is integration, and ensuring that there is a distribution of affordable units across a broader proportion of a geographic area. So, if I'm doing the sort of trade-offs in my head, and if all these different things interplay, like the feasibility, where you're looking at feasibility, it's like you can pull this level, adjust this knob here, adjust this knob there, and that changes the feasibility. And I would rather, in some ways, make sure that we adjust those other knobs in a way that allows the program to be expanded to those mid to high density sub areas that it doesn't apply, then I would like pushing for deeper affordability in the areas where it already applies because of that integrated potential. And then also if you had, I mean, I just don't love the potential distorting effects of, you know, when you have similar areas with similar density, zoning for density, and the areas where it applies, where it doesn't. And so that can distort where people are able to build or want to build. So, I mean, I don't know how much we've actually seen this in practice in this market because there's been enough demand where you've kind of been able to develop across a broader range of areas. But, you know, in other areas, I've seen some analyses of inclusionary programs where it applies in some neighborhoods and not, and then you see all the development going in the areas where the inclusionary housing policy, it doesn't apply. So I'd rather make in some ways, like make some nods towards development feasibility and some of the other levers in order to allow for a broader geographic targeted, broader geographic applicability.
Is that a choice that we're making, or can you do both?
I think what we found, and this is where we looked at, okay, is there a difference in achievable sales prices in areas that we might expand it versus where it exists today? Because that does get to this feasibility lever. And in this particular case of just where to expand the policy, we found that there wasn't a difference in achievable sales price. So in this particular case, we're not as concerned about feasibility here because we think that you can achieve, at least on market rate units, a similar sales price. And then lastly is on the extension of the Tyson's high-rise policy. And so here we identified areas that are zoned for high density development. And so there are areas outside of Tyson's that are zoned where theoretically there could be high-rise condominium development. But then we looked at, in terms of high-rise condominiums, what's actually been built. And we found that other than the one in Tyson's, there had not been a single high-rise condominium development in the county in over 20 years. We also did note that there was the proposed high-rise condo development in Reston, but that we didn't see any movement on that, or we couldn't find any record of any movement on that since 2018. And then what we also looked at is because in this particular case, the construction typology for high-rise, you're moving from wood frame construction to concrete or steel, which just increases the costs significantly. And so because of that, the sales prices needed to support this kind of high-rise condominium development are extremely high, about $850 a square foot, which is about a 7-figure condominium, which is when we looked at what the condominium project in Tyson's is selling for, averaging about 7 figures a unit. And so because of that, there really aren't places in the county because where that type of sales price is achievable. And so because of that, at this particular time, we don't really see an argument for extending the high-rise policy outside of Tyson's because we don't see, given current market conditions, high-rise condominiums really being built elsewhere. That being said, if market conditions are to change in the future, we think that at that time you could reevaluate extending the policy.
And I think that last one's a really important point, just that Fairfax County is and will continue to change. And I think that, where the recommendations we're making today are to sort of adjust the program to where we need to be, and that these are things that we're going to have to come back to at some point, and maybe there will be, the economics may be there at some point, maybe not be, but thank you. Questions?
Those were really kind of our findings and recommendations for this particular task force meeting. I know that we will continue to work with the county and sort of work to refine some of these recommendations and, in September, kind of present together sort of a full suite of recommendations to you all at that time.
Yeah, and I think, given that this is the first time everyone's seeing it, I mean, we'd love to kind of just, if you have any further questions, I think it's, really important as they kind of put together this their full recommendations that we, kind of have the benefit of any additional things you might think of, or I'm not sure what the right forum is with the way task forces work, but I think that, we don't want to have just sort of radio silence, then come back to the set of recommendations, which, you've all seen, but haven't had a lot of time to digest. Just want to kind of, figure out space for that since we don't have another meeting before. Yeah, Fairfax County.
Any thoughts, questions, follow-ups?
I could, one thing on our to-do list, it sounds like to me is for the HRNA team to have a conversation with our partners from the development community to, kind of compare notes. I do think that it's going to be important for that to occur. I do also believe that, we're going to need, as your staff here at HCD, that we'll need to, be in a position to collect any comments, questions that you have over the course of the next month so that we can synthesize those and get us ready for, for September. Because, we are on a very fast track here to get recommendations to the board. We have a board housing committee in mid-November, which is our target. I think we've, made really, really good progress on an extraordinarily complicated and, might I add, nettlesome issue for all of us. And, I would just say that, that this, particularly this next couple of weeks, these first couple of weeks in August are going to be really important for you to digest what you've heard and get comments to us.
I just have a question on how it works, how workforces work. Is there like a vote? Is there a recommendation? How does this all work in September? Sorry.
So we have 2 more meetings left. The next meeting, we will continue to talk about, your thoughts on what the recommendations are. If there's additional follow-up about modeling and the financial impacts, we can talk through that. And ideally, we would begin to formulate you all would begin to formulate the direction of the recommendations at that next meeting. And then we would take a vote at the final meeting in October on what the recommendations might be, and trying to reach consensus on that.
Does that go to the next step, FCRHA, just go right to the board, or?
So the staff would then collectively present it to the board's housing committee.
Will it go to the planning commission too?
It would eventually go to the planning commission in the form of a plan amendment.
To the board for adoption. I think the housing committee is at the 28th November.
Gosh, I've only gotten so far as that it is actually in the month.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah. I think it's the 28th. Yeah. So I was, yeah, exactly. The 21st is Thanksgiving.
Nothing has to come out of.
I guess just doesn't feel like we need the 2 meetings, or good not feeling. If we can reach consensus and everybody's in agreement on the recommendations, I would think that we could end September. Motivation, so.
That's certainly possible.
Right.
We had talked about that.
Yeah.
So something to chew on. Again, this is the time to take the data and the recommendations and adjust it over the coming weeks.
And if we can, vacation schedules and all that, it may limit our ability to get together, but it would be great to have separate conversations with you all about some of the issues that came out today. That ready to go in September.
If I could just underline for everyone, there's an exciting opportunity to complete this work in September. And we'll just encourage all of us to work towards that goal.
would be amazing.
Is there a possibility to speak outside of the meet? I know you can speak individually. There's no, like if some great point happens and we're all educated on something, can you tell the rest of us by email or do we have to meet as a meeting?
We can tell you as an email, via an email, but there, we cannot have discourses.
But so if you learn something or somebody learns something, they can write to us. We can do that.
Well,
I mean,
it would need to come from us. to
You,
the
yes.
committee. So,
And we can discuss it at the September meeting.
I mean, I'm just asking, that might push September forward, right? Like if something happens in August without us getting together and something is learned or decided or what? The rest of us can hear it. before we get in. Right, push in September, Tom, I'm just.
Yeah, well, and even our meetings would have to be limited to two, that's not task force meetings. Yeah. if we were to, you know. Or we would just have to notice them and then they would be public, so.
And we would welcome conversations with next week.
If that's possible, while it's all fresh.
Great. Oh, if there's anything else? Adjourn early. All right,
thanks, everybody.
we're adjourned. Thank you. And I can go back to work. Yeah. Go back to court.
Yeah.